Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is exactly 2 p.m. and I will go ahead and get started doing the introduction as people trickle in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome back. And if you are just joining us, welcome to the third webinar in the 7-part series entitled Understanding Trauma, Unpacking a Culturally Responsive Approach to Serving Sexual Assault Survivors During COVID-19. My name is Erica Blackwood, and I am the SADI specialist for NC CASA. This series will provide training and practical applications for supporting survivors of sexual violence in the midst of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and civil unrest. Our focus is on helping advocates create accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approaches to the unique needs survivors are facing.
Hey Erica, this is Gabriella. I think we lost your audio because I can't hear you. Okay, it looks like Erica logged off, probably so she can log back in. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Amanda so that we could start our webinar, and anything that Erica missed, we'll go ahead and get at the end. Amanda, feel free to start.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and Gabriella, please feel free just to interrupt if Erica logs back on and needs to do any other parts of the introduction that she was going to do. Welcome everybody back to this trauma series. I am with you again today. It's my honor and privilege. Today we're going to be talking about trauma in the body. Last week we were talking about the brain specifically, and what trauma does just to the brain functions, how we think, how we react, some of those alarm system responses in our body. And today we're going to take just sort of a little bit of a broader look at just the whole body systems. Let's see if I can move forward here. Here we go. So we're going to look specifically at somatic symptoms. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the bodily symptoms that people experience from trauma. We're going to look at triggers and just what those are, and what they do in the body and what they activate. We'll take a brief introduction to the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Next week, Rhea Chapman will be with us, and she's going to go much more in depth into that, but I think it's useful to just touch on as an introduction here today, because this is obviously all connected in with how trauma affects us. And then we're gonna sort of wrap it up at the end with talking about resilience and healing, and again, what we do with this information, how we're becoming trauma informed, and how we take what we are learning in this series and apply it to the people that we're working with. And so that's where we're headed today. I will leave some time at the end today to do questions, but if, as we're talking today, if there are questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. I have that up so that I can see it. Hopefully if there's any questions through, I will see them when they come through. Also, just a brief reminder of being sure to just practice some self-care today, that There may be some stories or examples that might be triggering or upsetting to your own histories of trauma. And just be mindful of that. Take time away if you need to step away from your computer, to do whatever you need to do to care for yourself during this time. All right, so if you remember our person from last week with all the boxes stacked up, we talked about how trauma has a cumulative effect, with each exposure to a traumatic experience being sort of like stacked on top of one another, and how this causes our body to adapt and change in certain ways to accommodate sort of the level of toxic stress that would be. And that can be various types of trauma that a person is going to accumulate over the course of their life. Specifically here in this series, we're looking at the intersections of sexual assault, which many of you would be working with, survivors of sexual assault. Also the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all living through. And then just the civil unrest and racialized trauma that many around us are experiencing. And so as we're looking at sort of how those boxes stack up for people, we are going to be talking about just how those things interplay with one another and affect the body. And so we know, last week we laid a foundation of talking about how trauma actually affects our brains. And so it's not a stretch to know that trauma also affects our bodies. The somatic symptoms are physical symptoms that a person has. They're separate from emotional or mental symptoms like depression or anxiety. And it's worth noting, like, these symptoms are real. They are not just imagined. They're not, as I've heard the criticism before, like, oh, that's just in your head. You know, you're not, you can breathe. You don't, in a panic attack or in those moments of trauma, sometimes the shortness of breath is real and the pressure on the chest. And sometimes I've heard the criticism that, like, that's just all in your head. But these symptoms are actually real physical symptoms that a person may have as a result of trauma. Headaches and migraines, chronic migraines are something that people deal with after trauma. Stomach upset can include just like a wide variety of things, including diarrhea, constipation, nausea, sort of any of those digestive issues can be included in that category. Sometimes people just hurt, they feel achy, and they just have various pains in their body. Sleep issues are very common with people who have experienced trauma, and this sleep issues would fall under the category of somatic symptoms, and that can be, for a lot of people, it's insomnia, where they just can't get a good night's sleep, and whether that's because their mind is racing or because they're having nightmares or night terrors even. Those kind of night terrors or nightmares can be about specific traumatic experiences like assault or experiences of racism or discrimination, or it can be just completely unrelated content. It can just be scary dreams. But for a lot of people, sleep is something that evades them, and they have a really hard time regulating after trauma. Appetite, man, I hope that we can all relate to this one. People are joking about the COVID-19, as in the 19 pounds that we've probably put on while we've been at home, stuck in our houses and eating while we're sitting around. And I think there's something to be said to that. I'm interested to see like kind of what studies may come out of this time period to see if people really are gaining weight, because we know that like stress just affects our appetite. Some people, you know, they just lose their appetite. They don't want to eat anything. But for a lot of people, food is, you know, the idea of comfort food, things that using food to help us feel better. It often includes, you know, carbs and sugars, because those particular food items like elicit the feel-good chemicals in our brains, and they help us feel better for the moment. But obviously, over time, when we eat our feelings and we eat our stress, that can cause some health problems over time, especially when it's not healthy foods. But I think we can probably all identify with the sort of changes in appetite and that being related to stress or trauma. But then on the right-hand side here, we have like actual medical diagnoses and disorders that are often common that go along with trauma, like high blood pressure, people who chronically they can't naturally get their blood pressure to go back down, and so they have to be on medications to manage that blood pressure. People get sick more often, where their immune system is sort of broken down. They catch colds and viruses and, you know, the flu or just any sort of illnesses that their body is just a little bit more susceptible to. I've worked with many people who have been diagnosed with fibromyalgia and just sort of the pain disorders there, or chronic fatigue that kind of comes in from those sleep disturbances, autoimmune disorders, and heart disease, you know, cardiovascular issues, heart problems. And those are all like diagnosed medical conditions. And so again, these are real symptoms that people are having that have a basis in a medical diagnosis as to what's going on in their body, which is caused by exposure to trauma. Now, there is, I think it's worth mentioning that there is a category of symptoms, especially when we're talking about mental health disorders. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's the DSM, it's what mental health providers use to diagnose mental health, you know, disorders or conditions. There's a category of conditions called somatoform disorders, which are where the people that we're working with, they have bodily symptoms, but they don't have, like, the medical providers around them can't nail down or diagnose a specific medical condition, and in particular, like neurological disorders or diagnoses that would go along with this. And so, for example, I worked with a woman who had a long, severe history of childhood sexual abuse and had substance abuse issues throughout her adulthood, and then ended up having 2 other sexual assaults in her adult life as well. And as an adult, she began to have seizures. And kinds of medical experts, and had all the EEG tests and everything that she went through, none of them showed any reasons why she should be having seizures. And so she didn't have epilepsy. She didn't have any other neurological conditions that would account for these seizures. But over time, we realized it's something in the mental health world we called, or it's diagnosed as conversion disorder, where the body just takes stress and trauma, especially, and manifests these physical symptoms. And so for her, it was these seizures, and which unfortunately I got to witness. It was a real medical phenomenon that was happening for her. She really did have a seizure on my couch in my office. But again, it wasn't tied to any other neurological conditions. And so it's worth mentioning that, again, these aren't just made up or just all in the head, but these are tied to the mental health symptoms that some people are experiencing from the trauma that they have been exposed to, and especially complex trauma. So like we talked about last week when we were talking about the brain, a key player in many of these somatic symptoms that a person is experiencing is the stress response system in the body, what I call the alarm system, and how it activates to address what the brain perceives as a threat or as danger. And it releases chemicals into the body to make the body work and function in certain ways in order to address that threat, and in order to promote survival in that moment. And so it's called your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous systems. But these are activated by the amygdala, which again is that kind of the smoke detector that is looking for danger and can set off that alarm whenever it feels like there is danger around. And there are several chemicals that are associated with that stress response, but cortisol is the primary stress hormone, the one that seems to be, there's a lot of research on cortisol and what it does, and it seems to kind of play the primary role in the stress response. Cortisol, just as a brief recap from last week, I touched on this, but cortisol is an amazing chemical in your body. It does a lot of important things in the moment. It will constrict the arteries in the heart and in the blood, blood vessels and things, so that when it's combined with adrenaline, the heart rate increases and you have a higher blood pressure to be able to carry blood throughout your body, which would be needed in situations of threat, but also just to help you have faster responses. It prioritizes functions of the body, and so cortisol will suppress like the immune system, digestive functions. It suppresses the metabolism, because in those moments of direct threat, these long-term, like having a long-term effective immune system is not super important if your brain is perceiving that you are facing, threat or death in the next 5 minutes. When people are in active trauma or when their alarm system is going off, they're not usually going around and being like, I'm kind of thirsty right now. I could use some water. They're not tuned into those and sort of and other digestive functions, like how their stomach is feeling, and the way their bowels are constricting or moving isn't functioning as effectively in those moments, because cortisol is helping the body prioritize survival. Another important factor is that cortisol increases blood sugar levels. It takes the glucose out of the liver, puts it in the bloodstream, so that you have the blood sugar and the energy to carry out the stress response that's needed. And obviously these things help in the moment of survival, help in that exposure to direct danger and threat. However, over time, these things can lead to bigger problems, like weight gain, or if the body is continuously dealing with an increased levels of blood sugar, sometimes the pancreas can't keep up with that, can't absorb the blood sugar and use it and convert it, and so that's how diabetes develops, type 2 at least, where the pancreas isn't as effective at managing the blood sugar levels that are in the body. Obviously, if the arteries are constricted over time, and this is happening for a while, that's going to create some heart issues and cardiovascular problems. And so again, leading to issues with higher blood pressure, higher sustained heart rate over time. And all of these can be tied specifically to this hormone, to cortisol. And so it's got a good function in the body, a good reason that it's there. But when people are exposed to trauma over and over and over again, or they are constantly having this influx of cortisol into their system, it's going to affect the way their body is working. And this is pretty closely tied to the idea of triggers. And triggers really they can literally be anything. It's anything that reminds someone of a traumatic memory that they've had, a traumatic experience that they've gone through. It could be people or places. It could be certain types of weather outside, you know, just with the fall and the crisp air that comes, there's a certain feeling that fall has that goes along with that. And those feelings, if traumatic events have happened in the fall, say for example, that first like breath of crisp air might trigger somebody to remember. Their body remembers and associates that feeling with, you know, that time of year when that particular traumatic event happened. And a lot of these are tied to our five senses, which we talked about last week, that plays a big role in the alarm system response in our body. But our senses are really strong. They carry strong reminders. So songs can be a trigger for people. Like I can listen to a particular song. If I hear it walking in the store, it will immediately remind me of, like, say my high school crush that I had in high school, because we danced to that song at homecoming, as a sort of a silly example. But like, man, I am sure everybody, there are people on this in this webinar this afternoon that can just be transported by songs, and how they just take us back to different times in our lives. And sometimes, hopefully for a lot of us, those are good memories, and or funny or neutral memories. But for some people, you know, those are associated with traumatic events as well. Smells are really, really powerful for people. You know, a certain smell of a yeast roll, a particular dinner roll, can transport me back to my grandfather's kitchen and the yeast rolls that he used to make. But for some people, like say in the summertime when it's hot and there is, you know, body odor, and you're walking past somebody in the grocery store and you smell that sweaty BO smell. That is, I have heard so many times how that's a very strong reminder or a trigger for people who have been sexually assaulted, because there's something, you know, perhaps they smelled that smell when they were being assaulted, but it's so closely tied to those memories of trauma. Smells can be. And so, again, it can be anything. It can be specific anniversaries and dates and times of year. I was just talking with someone yesterday about how her birthday is coming up, and she happened to have been assaulted on her birthday several years ago. And so just knowing that that specific date and that time is coming up, like those are hard anniversaries and dates to get through. And all of these things just remind us of things in the past. It's also worth noting that some of these things are like conscious. We know that they're triggers, especially for traumatic events. Like we can say, some people would have a direct awareness and like a conscious connection to the triggers and why they are responding the way they are. But there are a lot of people who have triggers that they don't even know of, that the triggers are sort of unconscious for them, that all of a sudden, you know, they're just going about their day, and all of a sudden something, like they just start to feel panicky. They start to feel really anxious, or they start to feel depressed. They start to have, you know, memories that are coming up, or actual flashbacks where they're reliving the traumatic events that have happened, and they can't put their finger on, you know, what particular trigger has caused those reactions. And so that's kind of the work in therapy that I get to do in the mental health treatment is helping people try to identify, because when we can bring awareness to the triggers, they lose some of their power in some ways. But often an unconscious trigger is emotions. When say somebody gets a nasty text message, or they have an interaction with somebody that just leaves them feeling like put down or disrespected or blown off. Those particular feelings can be memories of previous times in traumatic experiences where they have felt those same ways. And so on the surface, it looks like it's, not connected at all to that specific traumatic event. It looks like it's just connected to this conversation with this other person. But again, I like the phrase "the body remembers," which is actually a book title you should read. But it's a way that our body knows these feelings that we've had before and associates them with traumatic experiences. And so, so we want to help people gain insight into their triggers, and the more insight and awareness that we can build around the things that are making us have the reactions that we do will help us all along in the healing process. As we're dealing with, all the different types of trauma that we may have experienced ourselves, but especially, the ones that we're helping our clients with. So sometimes it's the things of the past, triggers that are reminding us of things that have happened in the past, but also our body is reacting to present danger and current threats. So, for example, people are on increased levels of alert because of the COVID-19 virus. That is, not as new as it was, say, 4 or 5 months ago, but we are all still adjusting to life and what life is like now with this virus that's running around. And so every time we put on a mask when we get out of our car to go into the grocery store, you put on your mask to go in, and our brains are getting the signals that our environment is not safe, that the people around us could be a threat. They could be putting us in danger. And so our bodies are responding to this increased level of danger. So in some ways, our alarm system is starting to go off. Each time we have these triggers or these reminders of just how we're confronted with this virus in everyday life. This is also something that, like, people of color this is not new to them. This is something they've long been experiencing. There's still current threats and current danger to the people of color around us due to the culture of just white supremacy. It feels like, especially here in the South, that it's not safe at times, and in some places. And just simple things like going for a jog or going into the store or sitting in your own home may not feel safe, or it may not be safe for some people. And so the level of alert and the alarm system and it is going off and putting people of color into just higher states of alert and alarm, just simply because of just the racialized trauma and the civil unrest that I think that is pervasive in our society right now. It's this type of racialized trauma that carries significant effects in the body. And Tracy opened our series talking about the systemic racism and structural racial inequity that exists in our society. If you remember I loved her tale of two neighborhoods with the differences in the housing and the jobs and the schools based on the two neighborhoods that the families lived in. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about racialized trauma and the structural racial inequity that people of color, marginalized populations are being exposed to right now. And this type of trauma is not usually just a one-time experience. It's not just one box in the stack, it's one thing that happened, but it is chronic over the lifespan of people of color. Microaggressions are a great example of these everyday interactions and discriminations that people of color are facing. And it's these chronic biases that are expressed towards lots of marginalized populations. But yeah, it is not only occurring when people are directly experiencing racism, it's also vicarious in the sense that now we have more exposure to trauma by being able to watch it on video. Like we know what it's like now, unfortunately, to watch a man suffocate from having someone kneel on his neck. We know what it looks like when a man is shot at point blank range with a shotgun and how he staggers backwards and falls down. These are things that I haven't witnessed personally. Many people haven't witnessed someone shot or killed right in front of them. And so, but at this point now with social media, news outlets, iPhones, and police body cameras, all these things that we now have access to, we are now witnesses to this specific racialized trauma. And we are seeing it happen sometimes in real time and unfortunately sometimes over and over and over and over and over again, where I think some people can get into the spots of watching those videos over and over again, the same things. And then these incidents just keep happening. And so it's vicarious in the sense that we're all, it's affecting our minds and our bodies in the same way when we are witnessing the trauma that's happening to our friends, our family, our neighbors around us. And it's these racialized traumatic incidents that are increasing, it's causing an increased cortisol response in people of color. And it's due to this ongoing toxic stress and the racialized trauma. It's creating health disparities between African Americans and whites. And the CDC had some great infographics and some things that I've included some of the citations at the end as well, but just that African Americans are more likely to have higher blood pressure than whites, especially ages 35 to 64. That's 50% more likely. That's crazy. They're twice as likely to die from heart disease than white people are. And that they're dealing with these health issues at much younger ages than white people are. Like somebody who, an African American in their 20s and 30s being diagnosed with heart disease at that point, that's significant. That's noteworthy that we need to pay attention to. Tracy also mentioned in the beginning series that in some communities in North Carolina, there's that 10-year life expectancy difference. And this is because of, well, obviously it's not as simple as boiling it down to one or two factors, but it's a complex issue. But these health disparities are real. Some factors that go into this, that increased cortisol response that I was talking about, I think it's tied to historical and personal experiences of racialized trauma, but really tied to systemic and institutional racism that's pervasive in our society. And when societies and neighborhoods and systems and institutions don't give equal access and opportunity for Black people to own their own homes, or they're not given fair share at job opportunities, you know, it can perpetuate cycles of living in poverty. And this infographic down here, just the fact that Black people are more likely to not be able to see a doctor because it's too expensive, because of the cost here. These are obviously exacerbating the health problems that they're dealing with, when simple cost of and access to affordable health care is not something that, you know, our country and our communities can ensure for the people around us. It's worth a brief note on just the study of epigenetics. Epigenetics is kind of the study of how trauma is passed down through generations. And it's a little bit controversial. I'll put that out there. It's a little bit controversial in the research and scientific community, because it's still a growing body of research. But it really is showing that trauma we know it has an impact on the body. And so scientists are really looking at how that affects the DNA and the genes in the way that a person that make up a person. There's been lots of studies. It started out with animal studies on like everything from monkeys to mice to worms. I even read a study about worms, and kind of looking at how, you know, inducing trauma affects the generations that come after. But there's been lots of studies too looking at descendants of Holocaust survivors, or the Rwandan genocides, looking at like what genetic changes were present in the descendants of those atrocities that they went through. And really research is showing that there seems to be a connection, that trauma does affect how genes are expressed in a person. So it's not whether particular genes are present or not, because we have the same genes, and it's tied to sort of the RNA instead of the DNA. It's the RNA about how those genes are expressed and what traits are expressed in a person. So we're all different. We all have different traits and different sort of the readout of our DNA. But what epigenetics really is showing is it's not about whether those genes are present and being passed on through the trauma and through the generations, but whether particular traits are turned on or off, whether they're expressed or repressed. So really this field of study took off when it was about 10 years ago. Scientists were published some studies that on the Dutch hunger winter, which I had never really heard before I started researching and looking into this myself. But it was a famine that took place towards the end of World War II. The Nazis blocked food supplies to the Netherlands, and over the course of that famine, about 20,000 people died, and the scientists looked particularly at the women who were pregnant during this famine, and how they and their babies were impacted by this famine. And so what they sort of came from and looked at was that the kids who had been in utero during the famine were found to have been several pounds, well, a few pounds heavier at birth than what had typically been the average weight for babies born during that time. And the thinking was that the mothers who were experiencing this famine themselves, because they were starving, they sort of automatically passed along a gene to their unborn children that conserved and slowed down metabolism so that they didn't burn the body's fuel as much or as effectively. And so they looked at those children again in middle age. They had higher rates of obesity, they had higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of the LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, and triglycerides. And so they were looking at the genetic studies of these now middle-aged people and just found specific chemical markers on some of their genes that were not in genes of other people who were not exposed to the famine. And so that really sort of changed the field of epigenetics, and it really brought up the idea that trauma affects people, not only, you know, just the person who has experienced the trauma, but it can be passed down through the generations, and it affects people. And so when we're talking about historical trauma, when we're talking about the trauma of slavery and racism in our country, we have a long history of that, and people can still be dealing with the effects of the trauma that happened generations before them. This, I think some of this was rooted and sort of started, really came more into the scientific community after the ACEs study was published, the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And again, it's just worth kind of doing a brief introduction here. There's a HMO called the Kaiser Permanente and out in California, and they launched this joint study with the CDC, looking, and they surveyed about 17,000 adults. And that's a rather large study, but so they surveyed them and they said, okay, the first thing we're going to ask is you just say yes or no to how many, have you experienced any of these 10 kinds of adverse childhood experiences that people could have. So physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect that you would experience in childhood. Did you grow up in a household where someone had a mental illness, where one of your relatives was incarcerated? Was your household one in which your mother was treated violently by someone in the household? Was there substance abuse? And was there divorce or separation of your parents? And if you add up, if you kind of do the check boxes and say, okay, yes, 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 here, these are the things that you experienced in your childhood, that becomes what's called your ACE score. And so it's really just, how many of these things were you exposed to? And then what the researchers looked at is they just said, okay, well, how many people smoke right now? How many people use any sort of illicit drugs? How many days in the past year have you missed of work? Have you been diagnosed with any of these particular health disorders like diabetes, STDs? Do you have any heart disease? Have you been diagnosed even with like COPD? Have you had broken bones in your life? Have you been diagnosed with cancer? And so what they were really starting to look at was just the connection. And they just said, is there a connection? We think there probably is, but they found this very clear connection that the more ACEs that you have, the more traumatic events you were exposed to as a kid, different types of them, the higher likelihood it is that you will experience negative health outcomes in the future. And there's been so much research that has spawned off of this. It's really changed a lot about how social policies and healthcare, I think, is it's hopefully changing that to address and screen for these ACEs in childhood, because we now know that, you know, just if a kid is coming through the office that I work at and I screen them for ACEs and I know they have, you know, a couple ACEs, 3 or 4 ACEs, then I can probably go ahead and give them, you know, information about, you know, healthy diet and exercise and ways to, you know, making sure they're connected to doctors so they can get health screenings earlier on, so that if they are diagnosed with cancer or things like that, it can be caught earlier on, hopefully improving those health outcomes. But we've learned a lot from that study. But one of the things I think is interesting is that, let's see if they'll let me go back. Here we go. On this list, like racial trauma isn't listed as one of these things. It's not listed as an adverse experience that somebody would go through that could affect their health in the future. And I think many other, I'm not the only one to have recognized this omission here, but that there have been, you know, further studies or things that have come from that. And again, Ray is going to be speaking a lot more to this next week, but I loved this chart specifically because it's really talking about the embodiment of historical trauma and how that plays into and sets up perhaps exposure to some of these ACEs. And so just the social conditions that exist that set families up, make them vulnerable to experiencing these ACEs. For people of color, like the incarceration rates for people of color is much higher than for whites. And so, well, that's an automatic, you know, that's one of the adverse childhood experiences on the list. And so it makes them sort of predisposed to having higher numbers of ACEs in the first place. But really, then again, speaking to just historical trauma and just the racialized trauma that's been passed down through the generations and how it's also affecting. And so I don't want to step on Rhea's toes, and she's got a lot of great things to share next week as well. But want to just kind of offer this as an introduction, as a way to kind of get us thinking about how just our histories affect us and go on as the trauma effect continues to show up and manifest in our bodies. So if we're going to look at how we move forward and what we can do to help people really heal from all their experiences of trauma, and how we're really supporting resilience in the clients that we're working with, in the, you know, the kids around us, the people around us. There's a couple things personally that I feel are really important to do and to say. One of them is, I believe you. Many survivors of assault, you know, they don't report their assaults to the police departments because they know, they're just worried about being believed. They don't tell people, they keep it to themselves, you know, or, you know, even histories of child sexual abuse. You know, as adults, many people say, I've just never told anybody because who's going to believe that my pastor, you know, would be the kind of person to do this? They're going to believe him over me. Or, you know, just the way that our society questions victims and victim blames. And so it's really powerful to have somebody say, I believe you. I believe what you're telling me, and I believe that it happened because you say it happened. And it's also really important to say that it's not your fault. That assault and discrimination, racism, all of these things, it's not that person's fault that these types of trauma has happened to them. And that's some of the distorted thinking that can go along with trauma, where people blame themselves and feel like they are, you know, it is their fault and they're the ones to blame for what happened. And so in my experience, these are two of the most powerful things that we can say. It's really powerful to sit with somebody and just listen to them and to listen to their stories, their personal experiences of racism and discrimination. There is an astounding number of white people, especially that I've been exposed to recently, that just believe that racism doesn't exist. And it blows my mind. And so I think it's really powerful to sit with, you know, the people around us and just say, what has your experience been like? I want to know. And then to believe them when they tell us. We have to validate people's feelings and empathize with them. Many people know Brene Brown. I love a lot of her work, and I love this quote. In order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it, and not how you imagine their experience to be. And gosh, I just find that really powerful, that taking my opinions and my perceptions off of it, to really listen to somebody and what their experience has been, and believing them is just a really great and important first step, I think, towards connecting with people and being able to empathize with them. Also, we have to, if we're you know, today specifically just talking about trauma in the body. So I think it's important then that we do some body-based interventions that are going to address the trauma that's there. If that's where the trauma is and that's what is being affected, then we have to address that. So there are a couple different modalities or trauma treatments that specifically target trauma in the body. One of them is neurofeedback. It's a type of therapy that works off of information on what the brain waves are doing in a particular moment. And so it's like essentially like an EEG where it kind of reads brain waves and gives feedback to the person in the moment about what their body is doing and experiencing. Something sort of similar, doesn't involve wires and all of that, but it's the practice of mindfulness. It's paying attention to the details of the present moment. So we talked about how trauma makes you dissociate, makes you feel disconnected, and especially from your body. Mindfulness is retraining your body and your brain to be connected again, and to be present. So for example, to take you through a quick exercise, is I want you, wherever you're sitting at the moment, or standing if you are, imagine that you have sort of a magnifying glass in your hand, and you are going to sort of take that magnifying glass over various parts of your body to just tune in to really notice what's going on. So right now in this moment, what's going on with your neck and your shoulders? Some people might be all scrunched up, bent over a desk, which is what I am doing right now. It draws it, it's making me pay attention to what I am doing as well. So take your shoulders and bring them back down a little further. Stretch it out a little bit. Move your neck around. For some people, you may not have noticed or been tuned in to how tight that those muscles were and how scrunched up that you were. And really, mindfulness is the practice of just tuning in and noticing what's going on in your body. So like another example would be to take that magnifying glass and tune in and observe what's going on in your stomach right now. Are you anxious? Does it feel like butterflies in there about something? Do you feel hungry? Do you feel bored? Maybe. Sometimes those things can get mixed up and confused for one another, and we eat when we feel bored. But those are different feelings in our stomach. Anger feels different than fear does. And sadness feels different than anxiety does. And for a lot of people, those feelings are held in our gut and held in our stomach. And learning how to tune in using mindfulness to differentiate between those is really important, because then once you can draw awareness to what you're thinking or feeling or what's going on in your body, you know what to do to address it. And you know, it brings awareness to what's going on rather than just a confused feeling of, I don't feel good. I love asking that question to clients. How are you feeling right now? And they're just like, bad. We need to learn to distinguish, you know, what's going on in our body beyond just feeling bad. So hopefully that helps kind of break that down a little bit. And obviously there's much more that goes along with mindfulness, but there's some great things put out by Peter Levine. He does somatic experiencing, which is tied a lot to mindfulness and how we pay attention and get feedback from our bodies and work with our bodies to heal the trauma that's there. Massage is another one. Man, I could use a massage. But massage, acupressure, acupuncture even. Some of the therapies used in mental health world, like if you've heard of emotional freedom technique, which is sort of tapping, it's all kind of based around the idea of using pressure points in the body to release tension, to release trauma, to promote relaxation. I would hope many of us have had the opportunity to have massages in our life, but just the idea that you can come away from a massage, for some people it maybe isn't enjoyable and it's not something they really feel relaxed from, but a lot of people do get relaxation out of massage, and getting the body to a relaxed place is an important part of, again, turning off that alarm system, sending the signals that you are safe and calm and that, you know, there isn't danger present. And then other types of sensory-based interventions, like aromatherapy is a really good one when you are using essential oils or incense or different scents that help promote relaxation. It has a physical effect on your body. It helps your heart rate decrease. It helps your, you know, blood pressure go down. And even things like other sensory-based things would be pet-assisted therapies, like equine therapy, or having a therapy dog present in the office that you work in. I think a lot of us can identify with the just good feelings that come from having pets around, and how we can connect through sensory through our sensory connections to those animals. And when we you know, pet them and we feel their fur or their hair, that it helps us be present in the moment with another you know, animal, another person, another thing with us, and helps us be more connected. And there's a lot of research that's gone into why animal-assisted therapies are also helpful. It just feels less threatening than talk therapy can sometimes. But other types of sensory-based interventions, again, we're speaking the language of the body, and the language is those five senses. And so when we speak that language, it helps us connect and process in different, sometimes better ways. Also, dance is actually a really powerful modality. Both dance, it's a form of expression. It's a way to, for often people who have traumatic experiences, it's hard to put it into words. You know, it's hard to talk it out or to really fully express yourself. And so a lot of people have connections just with feeling like they can express themselves through dance. But dance, as well as yoga, is another really powerful body-based intervention. Both of these modalities allow a person to just learn to get back into their body in a safe way and to be connected with their body. You have to kind of know where where your body is in space around you to dance, to be any sort of a good dancer at least. But with yoga, you got to know where your arms and your legs are and how to move and use your body and connect with it, especially through breathing techniques and everything. And trauma-informed yoga practices are just astounding to help people really reconnect with themselves and get back in touch with their bodies. And they're showing incredible results for helping reduce that alarm system, for turning it on, reducing anxiety, some depression even. Bessel van der Kolk has done quite a bit of research on trauma-informed yoga practices, and it's just showing just so many positive benefits. Art is another very powerful modality. Again, for some people who can't express their trauma in words, they can express it in a color. They can express it through shapes and through movement in art, through abstractions, through things that are very concrete, putting a collage together, or a painting, or all kinds of art, creating clay and sculptures. It's a really powerful modality. And again, it's based in the body, just helping people express themselves. And you don't have to be good at art. Some people will say like, oh, I'm not any good at that. I don't want to do it. But getting people to engage in any sort of expressive arts groups or activities can be really powerful to help give them some other ways to express themselves. And then lastly, music is just another way to do that as well, whether it's through dance or whether it's through singing. People connect with music, and they connect with lyrics. They connect with melodies and certain chord progressions, things like that, it speaks to our souls in different ways and helps us express ourselves. But also the physical act of playing, like learning and playing music, is incredibly powerful. So if anybody is familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, he wrote a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which is a fantastic book. It's heavy on trauma, but it's so good. He takes so many complex, issues about trauma and puts it in just very readable language. But he talks specifically about using drum circles, and how they have done quite a bit of research and have had a lot of experience where just putting kids in circles where they learn to start drumming. And if you learn to drum in rhythm, it helps your body build back in some of those, sort of at the very fundamental level, some of the rhythms that it needs to function properly. And so helping the brain rewire itself and build in rhythms of how the circuitry in the brain works, or all kinds of the systems in the body. And it's a fascinating subject to read about. But even the idea of whether it's drums, whether it's learning to play guitar, the things that have rhythm to it, and learning those things can, you're speaking at a very cellular level to the body about how to stay in rhythm, and it helps the rhythms of your stress response system. And so these are things just to learn more about and to maybe incorporate into your practice or your organization if you can. All of these modalities, the 8 that I just mentioned, you should really know what resources are available in your community for these things. There are some people who are musicians who are out of work because of the pandemic. They're not doing events, and they have moved more towards offering music lessons. But would some people in your community be willing to donate an hour a week to teach a group music lesson at your rape crisis center? Something like that. Would that be something that the clients that you work with are interested in? Can you find somebody who does trauma-informed yoga to come do a class, at your center for the people that you're working with? People want to help, and they want to use the talents and resources that they have. And so giving volunteers opportunities to, come in, lead an art group, or lead a hip hop class. Lots of different opportunities are available there for engaging clients in these ways. Also, just knowing, like, with some of the other modalities I mentioned, like neurofeedback, equine therapy, some of those sensory-based modalities. Oh man, some other ones that could be helpful are the emotional freedom technique. Brain spotting is another one I didn't mention. Finding resources or clinicians in your community who do those forms of therapy, just so that you have them as a resource and a referral source for the clients that you're working with. If you feel like those could be beneficial, I think it's important to kind of have a list ready and to say, hey, if that person is experiencing a lot of somatic symptoms, if they are really struggling with a lot of these health issues, how can we link them to these resources in the community, again, that can be affordable, that can be accessible to them? And how can we help make that happen? How can we write grants, and how can we apply for grants to support these kinds of therapies? How can you hire people to make that available at your agency? But we got to think through through some of these modalities and how we can just increase access for people to these body-based interventions, because regardless of whether they're doing talk therapy, maybe that's very helpful for them. I think that they should also have opportunities to engage in yoga or art or whatever it is that they would feel connected to. But I think engaging in multiple of these interventions, not just choose one and that's the only thing you get, but really trying to kind of soak in as many as you can, I think would be helpful. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure, last time I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions, and so I wanted to leave some more time for questions, either based on stuff we've talked about today, about how it affects our body, or even last week as well on any of the brain stuff that we were talking through. But I want to open that up to questions, and you can put those in the chat box if you have them. While you're thinking about questions too, I'll do the same thing that I did last week, where I will send the PDF version of this PowerPoint, and we'll send it out to everybody so that you can have this for future reference. And then also included in here, I did put some things if you want to know more about these subjects. One of the things I'd highly recommend is Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is listed there, but that's a reference. I mentioned it last week as well, but it's just a fantastic book. Again, very relatable. I didn't put Dr. Bruce Perry. I'll add his in there because he's got some great stuff too. But yeah, just we'll kind of leave that open for the past thing for a few more minutes just to see if there's questions. And while we're waiting, I'll just check in with Erica. Was there anything that you needed to add from the beginning when we lost you?
Yeah, no, sorry about that. But thank you for going ahead and get started.
Yeah, no problem. We are all, I think, hopefully in the habits of extending grace over technology issues and just the difficulties of
Right.
life virtually these days. So, no worries.
But yeah, thank you for those ideas about a few slides back where you talked about local programs doing like yoga and dance and things like that. Those were great ideas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, Virginia, thank you. Much grace.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any questions popping up, but I will just point out again my email address is there that you can reach me if you think of other questions down the way. Ooh, Deborah says they're incorporating painting into their group, which is great. We've done yoga, we'll pursue art. Yeah, that's hard too, because when we're talking about, a lot of these things would be offered in groups, like a yoga class or, the art therapy classes and things that are not meeting in person probably for a while. And so again, we've got to get creative with that too, about how we can help people engage in those things, because healing still needs to happen during this time too. But yeah, feel free to reach out. I appreciate your time and participation, and I know we've got just a lot of other great speakers and topics lined up, and so hopefully this was just a little bit of a setup for next week, kind of jumping into a deeper look at ACEs and just a historical generational trauma. And I'm sure the rest of our panel and presenters are going to do a great job. So I think you're going to enjoy them.
We got a few comments.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question too. Do you find clients accept and follow through with yoga, etc.?
It depends. Yeah, some yes and some no. When I make a referral for yoga, or when I'm talking to a client about it, I really try to give the reasoning behind it. Try to give a little bit of the background of, an education about what their body is experiencing and why that particular, why yoga could be helpful for them, to help them understand it a little more. Because on the surface, if you don't explain it very much, it just sounds like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go to yoga, and what is that going to do for me? But I think when people have a broader understanding of what the goal is, and I think it really just depends on the individual and their experience of trauma, because some people, it's just they still don't feel safe enough to be back in their bodies in that way and connected with themselves in that way, and so they just may not be ready for it at the time. But when people are ready, I think that they do tend to engage pretty well, and seem to get benefit out of it.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. We will go ahead and wrap this session up. We hope that we will see all of you back on October 6th at 2 p.m. for our next Understanding Trauma webinar. I hope you all have a great day and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you, guys.